The following program is an encore presentation.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Summer is here. Maybe that allows time to slow down, savor a good book, be more mindful readers. That's what we're doing all this week with Governor General's Literary Award-winning poet and writer, George Elliott Clarke. Giller Prize-winning authors Dr. Vincent Lam and Elizabeth Hay, and writer and novelist Thea Lim. Tonight, the writing life. That's next on The Agenda in the Summer.
I wanted to talk about the F word, the other F word, failure. And we seem to live in a culture, in a society where you should not fail. Like, failing is a mark against you. But I've always found, my philosophy is that failure, it's information. Like, if you do something, it doesn't work out, at least you don't have that what if thing, and you move on. Elizabeth, you have 10 books?
Oh, I don't know.
You have
11, maybe.
11? You have a large body of work. Have you had anything that was ever rejected?
I have known rejection inside out. Both sides now. I was 39 before I got my first book published. So there was a long haul there of trying to figure out how to write. And then the next publisher didn't want to publish, or that publisher didn't want to publish the next book, and so on. So I've also had a little parade of publishers.
What's kept you going?
Oh, well, what else was I to do with my life? I mean, it was what I wanted to do. It was what I wanted to do. But yes, I think knowing how to deal with rejection is an essential skill. And that has to be relearned many, many times, because rejection takes different forms, and it's hard. It's hard.
George, I see you nodding.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Failure, for me, is just basically not having enough people buy enough books. And I wish I could do something about that, but I can't. So I live with it. Occasionally, there's a critic or two or three or four or five on to infinity who say ridiculously stupid things about something I've written, not really recognizing the great value of what I have created. And so that means I did have to. They are, Vincent. They are, absolutely. That's right. And as time goes on, it gets to be revealed more and more just how wrong they are.
But is there any good from? I mean, can you pick anything positive out of criticism?
Yeah, simply the fact that I get to write against the critics. I get to write against them. I get to take on their critique and turn it all around and throw it back at them.
It puts the fire in your belly, or you want to prove them wrong?
Well, a little bit of both. Basically, I think that for some critics, they just have not really thought enough, or they have moved to a very simplistic political critique. Without really trying to understand the nature of the work as a whole. And so I do feel that it's absolutely fair to fire back and castigate those folks and rub their noses in their errors.
I'm thinking of a story that I read about you, Vincent. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's not true.
It's not true. Lies, propaganda. But I read.
Those are George's critics talking about.
But I read a moment at the Gillers where someone came up to you and was saying something about your first book, that you were out of your depth, I think was something that they said.
Yes.
And so that was a criticism.
That wasn't very kind, actually.
No, so but because I see that as a criticism where if you receive it, you could see yourself failing. Had you not won the Giller that night, would you have felt that you had failed and this person was right?
Well, I mean, I think I felt quite hurt by that comment, despite having won the Giller, to be honest. And I think certainly within me there lives a great deal of what is sometimes called imposter syndrome. The notion that my errors are my own, but my accomplishments, I might not have deserved them. I do think, though, there are differences between different kinds of experiences of failure and what goes on in the world. And
What do you mean?
well, I think I fail every day. Well, not every day, but almost every day that I sit down as a writer. So I constantly imagine this glowing paragraph, this wonderful exchange of dialogue, this, this brilliant character, and then I write it, and it's just crap.
Yeah.
So I have to delete it and check it out. And so I really experience that as failure, but at the same time, I understand that to be part of the process.
Because you
And
keep going.
I keep on going. And so I understand that, yes, you know what, this was part of the process of writing the book, to get through this thing which I thought was going to be wonderful, but it was actually horrible, and then getting rid of it. So those are things that just happen inside. They never end up on the page that's published, but they're on pages that are thrown away. And so my last 2 books, I've thrown away significantly more than the volume of writing that's actually in the book. Experienced as failure, but then accepted just as part of the process. That's in some ways a more true kind of experience to me, because it has to do with the things that I can control, the things that I can accept, the things I can ultimately influence. I think the more fickle experience of failure is that which we hitch to something happening in the outside world, something which we ultimately don't have very much control over. So my first book, I didn't really expect it to be published, Bloodletting and Miraculous Cures. So I was quite shocked when it was published and astounded when it won a significant prize, the Giller Prize. But then my second book, I really set myself up for that fickle experience of failure, because my second book, I thought, oh well, this is going to happen and that is going to happen. All these, little milestones are going to occur, and they did not. And that was very foolish, I think, of me. Also very human, because we all do this, but that's a different experience. That's failure that has to do with, and here we're talking about fiction, right? With the fictional envisioning of something which we have no control over, versus the experience on the page, which we have a great deal of opportunity to grapple with.
And winning an award like, I'll come to you next, Liz. Winning an award like the Giller is, something that is just, it validates, especially in that moment that you had with this other person. Was there a crash after?
I think I went straight from the high of winning a prize to thinking, holy moly, whatever I do after this, it should probably be good. So it wasn't so much a crash, it was a sense of weight that descended upon me and lasted right until the second book was published, and all my foolish conceptions of what would happen were dashed, which felt maybe disappointing at the time, but in the big picture was really, really a healthy thing for me. And and so another year, another book.
And Liz?
Well, I think what we're dealing with here is that terrible feeling, the feeling of failure or rejection, of just not being good enough. So, and the self-pity that comes on the heels of that. So now I'm just describing myself here, but a huge Achilles heel on my part is having some form of failure and then feeling sorry for myself and having to pick myself up out of that. And it doesn't have to be, it can all be part of the working process, but it still happens. So maybe I'm working with an editor and I've written yet another version of this ridiculous manuscript. And yet again, it doesn't work. The unconvincing character remains unconvincing, or the drama that needs to happen isn't there. You still haven't done it. And so the degree of self-pity is horrible, and I try very hard to keep it to myself and let a couple of days go by. I might have to lie down a little bit, let a couple of days go by, and then what happens, and this is the great thing, the great transfiguration, is that then I look at what they're telling me and get a whole burst of energy and a fresh way of coming at the manuscript, and I'm reinvigorated and back with it. So it's as if, I sometimes think of it as this steering wheel that gets locked and you can't move it. And then something happens, this fresh way of looking, and everything flows again, and you're off with a bit more direction and a bit more shape in your mind.
I love the idea of sitting and in your feelings and feeling the feelings. That moment when you do decide, okay, I got to pick myself up. Is that intentional?
Yeah, I think it's really important that you let the disappointment register, and you kind of sink to the bottom, and then you can come up again.
When you write, you want your books to be read, and we've seen this happen before many times throughout history. Books being banned and certain people deciding which books people should have access to. George, I just wanted to talk to you about that because that's currently happening in the United States. Lupita Nyong'o, the Oscar-winning actor, wrote a children's book, and her children's book has been banned, which to me, I'm just like, that is absolutely ridiculous. What are your thoughts on what's happening right now with the book banning in the United States?
We have book banning here as well. Perhaps it doesn't get as much attention, but if you happen to write something or say something that triggers a kind of electronic keyboard lynch mob reaction, then it can get to the point where bookstores will actually threaten to pull your books off their shelves. And then when these things do happen in Canada, there's absolutely no one to come to an author's assistance. Absolutely no one who will actually defend freedom of speech. One of the horrible truths I've come to recognize in the last couple of years is that while we talk about freedom of speech and freedom of conscience and freedom of opinion, whenever anyone puts forward an idea that is unpopular, or the person himself, herself, themselves is unpopular, no one will come to the defense of that individual or the defense of that work. So it's not just the United States, which of course has become essentially a kind of dysfunctional theocracy. That's what they've got. That's what they've made for themselves down there. Margaret Atwood's prophecy in The Handmaid's Tale is coming true, for crying out loud, as we can all see. So I don't think we should really give ourselves all kinds of props like we're above that. No, we're not.
No, we're not above it. And there are people who do come to the defense of books, not necessarily consistently, but they do, and are often really castigated and hounded as a result. It's such tricky territory.
Is it fear that stops people from?
I read this little quotation from Billy Collins, the poet, about how everybody's ready to be offended. And I'm ready, he said, to be delighted. But we are in a time when everybody's ready to be offended.
Is this something that worries you about being censored?
No, not at all. I think we live in a time where we have to live with the consequences of our actions maybe more than previously. And if you write something or do something and you experience a backlash to that, a cultural backlash, it is information. And I think it's something that you have to work through the consequences of it, because the culture that we lived in before, there often was no backlash when people said or published or did things that were somehow hateful or oppressive to groups, no matter how small or insignificant one wants to think that group is. So in some ways I feel like, well, we live under a different sort of cultural moment and we all have to adapt to it. But one thing that I will say that I thought was really interesting was that often when a book is banned, the sales go up. So the funny thing I think about living in that happening in North America, because that's not the case in other places where, if you're thinking about a dictatorship or something like that, when a book is banned, it really does disappear. But the nature of it in our particular media is that it actually sort of raises the profile. So a lot of the time when we're talking about cancellation, what it means is that our work is entering into a cultural conversation where everybody together is trying to grapple with who we are, like as a people, what do we believe? And I'm sure that's very painful for an individual author to go through, but at the same time, you're part of the lifeblood of culture. Like, isn't this why you do this?
But just to push back a little bit, because the book that I mentioned, it's a children's book and it's banned. Some people are saying that the authors that are being targeted are Black writers. So
not to say that I think it's good or fine, but I think what George was talking about was something separate, which was like cancellation, as opposed to, cancellation is, I think, a lot of the time, the kind of banning you're talking about, I think it sounds to me like the dominant culture trying to reassert the social order, whereas cancellation is often kind of a disruption of the way that things have been happening before.
I think that cancellation is itself a form of tyranny, because what it does is that it shuts down any possibility for discussion, and it demonizes individuals.
But what about consequences, like Thea said? Isn't there a space for people to learn about and try to right their wrongs instead of saying, oh, I'm being canceled?
Of course there's a space for people to try to correct supposed or alleged misdeeds of one sort or another. But I think it's far more important to allow for conversation. The problem with cancellation is that it's extremely one-sided. And the whole point of it is to actually deplatform, silence, mute, oppress, kick somebody out of a conversation instead of having a conversation. So it's extremely oppressive. To me, it's just another version of the old-fashioned lynch mob. I think of the character of Cinna in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the poet who unfortunately has the same name as a conspirator who actually is one of the assassins of Caesar. And the Roman mob tears Cinna apart, limb by limb. They tear him apart because they are unable to distinguish between a completely innocent person who happens to have the same name as an assassin and the assassin. And even though Cinna is saying, I'm not the assassin, I'm not the assassin, the mob still tears them apart. They're not interested in having a debate. And I think the other thing that happens is that because there's a chorus of a mob shouting down a particular writer or intellectual or person, it means that there is actually no way to actually get at a truth or the truth, because it is being obscured, it is being deafened. The possibility of arriving at some form of rational judgment because of just the inundation, the tsunami of horrified, revolted persons who haven't actually even bothered to read anything.
When you use the term lynch mob, I know that when we say lynch mob, obviously there's been situations where people have actually been physically lynched and harmed, and that's not what you mean. I just wanted to say that because I can see you getting a text or. In your defense, I know that's not what you meant.
No, I want to maintain that. I want to sustain that. Because I think that a lot of the cancellers or the vigilantes, that's what I call
But there's a difference between physically being
No, I am talking about allegorical lynching.
Okay, that's what I was trying to make.
Metaphysical lynching.
That's the point I was trying to make.
In reality, when somebody is canceled, if we think of somebody like Jordan Peterson or we think of someone like J.K. Rowling, what actually happens is that the discourse around them grows ever more. I don't see that kind of silencing. So that's where I think that's what I'm saying, that I don't see cancellation having that effect on people. I don't see them silenced at all.
Yes,
it seems like the things that they want to talk about are ever more in the public sphere.
Vincent?
I do think that the effect of cancellation depends very much on the existing position of the person. I think you're quite right. If you're Jordan Peterson or you're J.K. Rowling and people aim to cancel you, that's probably going to bolster your case. And already people are speculating that Trump's charges will in fact strengthen his potential prospects for the presidency. But if you don't already occupy a sufficient cultural position, then I think cancellation is successful at simply subtracting people from the conversation. And I think of a writer whom I know, and I'm going to anonymize this because they haven't said I could talk about it, but I actually think it's a common enough story that is fair enough to anonymize this. So a writer whom I know, who was well published in North America, wrote a new manuscript, and they were told that it would not be published because they had occupied the voice of someone who it was not felt that they had the right to speak for. And of course, I don't know the specifics of the situation entirely, but it's striking to me that the criticism was a specific criticism which legitimizes a type of cancellation. Right? There's no literary criticism. It's a criticism which says, you know, you've written something from a voice which is not your own, and we feel that's a legitimate political reason to not
then again, this is a different, yet another, not tangent, but subject that we're entering in upon. Who has the right to write what? That author you're speaking of could write another manuscript and get it published.
Yes, and
he wasn't being cancelled.
What they told me is that they may rewrite it without that voice.
Right.
Right. But that to me is a loss in terms of the conversation.
Yes,
so
I agree. I do agree.
Absolutely.
The close, in fact, the most powerful effect of cancellation is self-censorship.
Yes.
It's
Absolutely.
that we then decide what we will not speak of for fear of cancellation.
Well, this is what I wanted to follow up on that. Salman Rushdie's Don Quixote book, he had a line that just stuck out in my head all these years after speaking to him, was that not everybody has access to free speech. Thea?
I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with self-censorship. I think we self-censor ourselves all the time in order to live in a society, you know. I think there's something healthy about that. I think what we're living through is a moment where the goalposts are changing, sometimes rapidly, sometimes even overnight, and it can be difficult for artists to adjust to that. I think there's things all the time that I don't write about. For example, as a Canadian writer, I'm constantly very aware of the fact that I'm a settler, and I'm constantly trying to figure out what is my moral responsibility as a settler, as someone who writes in this country, and how to represent those issues. And most of the time, I'm a coward. I back down. I don't put, you know, issues to do with land rights and things like that in my work because I'm worried about doing it wrong.
But can I ask
Yes.
a question? Is there a difference between a choice to not write about something because one feels from within that it's not one's purview or not one's it's not one's desire, and
It's not so much that it's not my purview, it's that I'm really worried I'm going to do it wrong. So it's a failure.
Right.
It's not
Okay.
me sort of saying, that's not my story, I shouldn't tell it.
Yeah.
It's actually really me being a coward and failing, you know, and it's something that I hope to correct over the course of my career.
it feels to me like a loss. I want to hear what you have to say about these things that are
Sure, but I got to figure out how to do it right. And I think, and it's like any other kind of artistic goal. You have to do it justice, and it's okay to have a voice inside you that says, figure out how to do this right. Don't just sort of, not everything I create is going to be, you know, politically correct, or not. I don't mean politically correct. It's not going to, you know, hit the right note. It's not going to be what my culture is useful to my culture right now. And it's good to know that and to get real with myself, as it were.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I respect that a great deal, and I still feel there may be a difference between those experiences and the experience of someone not writing something for fear of what someone else will say.
I feel like the solution is to get a Substack, like an online newsletter, and put, you know, and then I can publish my books, and then I can do my Substack anonymously. I feel like I understand. Yeah, no, it's true, because sometimes when you're afraid to take a swing, then that creates a kind of a national literature that's terrible and boring and sort of lifeless. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
I just want to add, again, cancellation to me is nothing less than just simple censorship, no matter what the reasons might be. I also do not accept the idea that there should be limits on what I can say, and that there should be limits on my imagination. As a writer, I seize the right to talk about whatever I want, to say whatever I want, with an audience in mind. But I do feel that it's absolutely imperative that we be able to speak to whatever truths we feel that we have to project, that we have to lobby for, that we have to put forward in the public spirit, public square, and welcome debate, welcome conversation, but not not the lynch mob attitude of shouting people down, slandering people, libeling people, cursing people, defaming people. That is not the way to have any kind of civilized discourse and conversation about anything at all in this society.
Before we leave this point altogether, I used to think in my innocence that the story went to the one brave enough to tell it. And I wanted to hear the stories and who the author of these stories would be was immaterial to me. It didn't have to, be politically correct. And I still, in my heart, think that's true. The story goes to the one brave enough to tell it. But there are big consequences if you cross boundaries, especially now, with cancellation, with vitriol and rebuke.
The prerogative of the poet. To recite a poem. This is a letter to a young poet. Go ahead and compose a poem on love. You'll poison it with the poetry. Sly darkness without any sweetness. See, the poet's body whelps carrion insects, vomits some worms, some ants, some wasps, some bees, things malevolent and marvelous at once. Their horrifically mixed up mouths chewing, ripping, devastating your heart. Poetry eats its lovers alive. You could get your throat slashed for this ominous obsession, but you have no shame. No, you have the face of a crushed horse, and capering therein 1,000,000 maggots, usurping every prickle of light.
With that concludes this segment, but you brought up so many great topics and themes. We are going to continue with them in our conversation tomorrow. Plus, I will be asking the question, what is the role of fiction and nonfiction? Once again, thank you so much. I'm learning a lot. And we're so Canadian, we're so polite, we're getting along, there's no shouting. This has been great. Next one. Everyone shout.
We're gearing up. We're gearing up.
Oh, you're gearing up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Our guests all this week are George Elliott Clarke, author of many books, including Where Beauty Survived, an Africadian memoir. Dr. Vincent Lam, whose new novel is On the Ravine. Elizabeth Hay, author of the just-published novel Snow Road Station. And Thea Lim, author most recently of An Ocean of Minutes.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
One of the reasons why I love Los Angeles, it's got the world's biggest problems.
Michael Colville Anderson is back.
That makes it dynamic when you live in a city that's not perfect and you still dream that it's going to be better, right?
Travel